Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. As always, I'm here, your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we have Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, back with us. So we got several kind of large items to talk about today and bring you all up to date on. And I think first we're going to start with sort of jumping off from where our previous episode touched on things that we're developing, and this is bizarre is not the right word, but this sort of continued strange nexus of Russia being invaded by Russians and Russia not seeming to be able to do much to stop that here, at least stop it completely. So that's where we're going to jump off from here. And Yuval, welcome back to another episode. And what is the latest on the Russians invading Russia?
Always a pleasure to be with you, Ian. And at this point, not only are Russians invading Russia to liberate Russia from the Russians are also bombing Russia in order to defend Russia against the Russians, seeking to liberate Russia from the Russians for the Russians. That's basically where we are at this point. I imagine this is crystal clear, so we can just move on.
Very, very strange cast of characters we sort of talked about last time. And the objective not necessarily being coincident with the goal of liberating Ukraine, but it does certainly seem to be against Putin, at least as in what the public statements from these groups doing it. But among the impacts that this has had is one, it continues to make Russian border defense not look all that great because, as you said before we started recording, it seems like the Russian military has yet to completely eject these groups from where they've done the incursions. But it also, something we'll get to here in just a second, it creates a problem for the Russian military in preparing to defend against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, if it's not underway yet, it sort of seems like additional preparatory actions are being taken, and therefore every Russian soldier who is up there fighting the Russians invading Russia is not in a position to defend their lines against the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
No, so certainly, the little bit of joking aside, as you put it, there are several impacts here. First of all, part of what I was teasing a little bit about was so basically there are several pro-Ukraine Russian groups, which range from basically, it looks to be sort of like all anti-Putin, basically in motivation, some of whom are far right, some of whom are not far right, but all of them are basically seeking to use violence against the Russian state, at least in principle, to help bring down the Russian state. But as you put it, the first thing that they're doing is they're diverting Russian military resources away from the defense anywhere else, basically along the line of contact, in the anticipation of the counteroffensive, in order to have to do more on defending basically border settlements in Russia. Now, in these towns, Shebykina basically being the largest, there's several others, Graivoron and others sort of like villages and towns, which basically are in the larger Belgorod region. What basically these anti-Putin groups have found is that the border was lightly defended at best, that these were effectively conscripts who did not were not anticipating any fighting whatsoever. So basically the border defense totally caught unawares, which is on one hand just malpractice, totally negligent, that they didn't assume, we're invading basically the neighbors might return the favor at some point. There's been plenty of chatter, plenty of videos that I've seen on Russian military bloggers on Telegram, in which basically someone says, "Hi, my name is so and so. I'm in this particular unit. We've lost 3/4 of our people because the colonel is forbidding us to leave, but also not giving us anything to defend ourselves. So when the Ukrainians start coming, or basically these Russian fascists, as they say, start coming, they're just shooting us, and we have no ability to defend ourselves or the motherland." So in that regard, two impacts. One is it makes basically, in terms of the psychological operation, the ability of Russia to defend itself now comes into play as a talking point, which makes people on TV just absolutely lose their minds. So that's one thing. The second thing is this highlights the challenges between the Russian army, responsible for border defense, basically retreating Wagner fighters who are coming back into Russia after having basically conquered most, if not all, of Bakhmut. We're starting to see that basically Russian army versus Wagner versus basically these like basically pro-Ukraine Russian groups are basically all fighting each other in different ways. This was highlighted most of all by these pro-Ukraine groups, which captured Russian soldiers. And they were in the position where they reached out to the local governor of the Belgorod region and said, we're interested in doing a prisoner exchange, because we've taken these people prisoner. The governor of Belgorod declined to meet with them because I'm sure he didn't want to take the responsibility of basically meeting with foreign invaders without direct approval from the Kremlin. And so Evgeny Prigozhin, who is basically the most named person on this podcast, said that he would reach out and deal with these people in order to get the Russian soldiers back. Prigozhin, for his part, his troops also captured allegedly a Russian lieutenant colonel who they looked like they roughed up quite a bit. But that lieutenant colonel said that his own Russian military troops had mined the escape route or the retreat route for Wagner soldiers or Wagner, mercenaries leaving Ukraine, and had in fact ordered his own soldiers to fire on the Wagner fighters as they were trying to leave Bakhmut. So in terms of just the worst types of people in the world, all meeting each other and all being opposed to each other for one reason or another, that's effectively what's happening on the territory of Russia, which again, as Russia's preparing for the counteroffensive, just creates a new series of logistical, operational, political, and ultimately strategic headaches, because it's not quite clear what's going to happen in Russia if you start to have different types of groups firing upon each other for different sorts of reasons, but all having the belief that they're going to be the next legitimate ruler of Russia.
Yeah, and this is something that you've mentioned before, and we've talked offline about this, but starting to watch the fracture lines, if you will, sort of emerging in whatever the post-war Russian order looks like, is like that you're starting to see different sort of centers of power and influence coalesce, I guess. And who only knows if Prigozhin makes it to the end of the war, if he's not removed from the board, if you will, by one of his rivals. But it's just I can't find the right word, but it's been odd to sort of watch in real time, like this, like Prigozhin go from this guy who runs a mercenary army basically that does goes and pulls in money for the Russian state. And I remember one of the first things you did for us was your broadcast talking about the Russian private military companies, and there's Wagner Group, and they're doing malfeasance in Africa and getting into Syria with the Russian operations there. And now he's like conducting his own sort of quasi foreign and military policy in terms of control of or defense of the Russian border and prisoner exchange and things like that. It's been a weird trajectory to watch. And for our listeners, we've sprinkled this in past episodes, but the war will come to an end at some point. But these are trajectories inside the Russian state to keep an eye on, because they will continue developing once the war is over, and may define what the post-war sort of Russian order looks like.
Yeah, and again, like if we dial it back even further, Prigozhin started out in armed robbery before moving on to hot dog stands, reaching basically the first apex of his career in catering, to take the career, a life well lived, as it were.
Yeah, there's the American dream. Maybe that's the Russian dream. I don't know.
Yeah, you go from hot dogs to challenging state power. I mean, we can all dream, apparently. But the other thing that's sort of like what Prigozhin sort of like, and again, trying to find the right words to not make it sound like this is insane and not trying to like poke fun here. But one of the key themes that we've been describing that this sort of border kerfuffle really sort of highlights, and even I say greater depth, is that Prigozhin's main sort of point, his main sort of like talking point is that he may not come from a military background, but that he's a true Russian patriot, one, and that basically he's a fantastic manager of like human and material resources. So that the more stuff that the Russian state has given to him, basically through Putin forcing, the Russian Ministry of Defense to give him things, is that he's been able to deliver. And as we've talked in previous episodes, whereas Shoigu, Gerasimov are, comfortable in Moscow and their children are even more comfortable in Dubai, whenever he does videos, the corpses are nearby, the armed men are behind him, you can hear the explosions in the background. To this point, the pro-Ukraine Russian units crossed the border, a week ago, 10 days ago?
Yeah.
The Russian state has responded by sending units to the front, including a 3-star general, to go basically to have himself recorded, in full battle gear, cheering, his platoon on, saying, for the motherland. But they still haven't defeated these forces. And in fact, they've ordered airstrikes, both let me take that back, at least artillery shelling of basically these pro-Ukraine units that have not been successful, leading to basically the weird situation where the Russian state is bombing Russian settlements against invaders who are comprised of Russian people. And that's essentially the thing that's insane to me. Russia's been invaded, albeit on a really small scale, and they still haven't retaken those towns.
Yeah, and I'm
into this.
Yeah, that's telling in some ways, and I'm going to circle back to that here in just a minute when we shift kind of to the next topic. But I don't know, maybe I'm just sort of spitballing here, but one of the other trajectories to watch is, and we talked about this as well, maybe in the episode where we focused on Bakhmut, but the presence of Prigozhin, like the clear presence, guy's a horrible human being, but the one thing, as you just mentioned, he's been there, and he can say that, and he's got proof to back that up, that he has been there in the fight, that Putin ordered for the good of the greater Russian co-prosperity sphere or whatever. But he's been there, he's been fighting the fight, and he can prove that. It makes me wonder if there's maybe another. This is kind of a dangerous trajectory to watch, but and I'm not making exact historical parallels here, but there is historical precedent for a large failed military operation, and then the people at the front who took absorbed the brunt of the fighting, took the losses, they come back home and say, hey, you guys, you failed us, you sold us out, we should be in charge now, one, and two, we're going to go back and we're going to finish the fight that you guys failed. So again, kind of, looking at the post-war trajectory here, which maybe at some point down the road we do look at it, but if and when the day comes that the Russian military is ultimately pushed back to ideally its starting lines, that's not the end of the story on the Russian side of the border, or in the halls of power out there. And we've hit on this before, but you mentioned there's Putin's whole thing has been about like holding together this weird coalition of the rich and the influential and keeping them happy. It's not a coalition that exists on its own in harmony, and there's going to be finger pointing when this is all over, and there is definitely historical precedent for the people who did the fighting to come back and point fingers and say, we're gonna, one, we should be in charge, and two, we're gonna finish, we're gonna win the war this time. And that's not something that's very pleasant to think about or look forward to, and hasn't really been discussed a lot. But it's not, I don't know, it's not necessarily something that's off the table looking at the whatever the post-war political order is.
As we start to move into like topics on the counteroffensive and so forth, a theme that for sure is going to start to emerge, in just like the universe writ large, as well as like, forthcoming episodes, is not just like what Russian air defense doing, but what Russian state doing. And it's really important that, this is sort of an abstract concept, but this is at the heart of what we're observing right now. Is the Russian state able to handle different kinds of problems all at the same time? What we're observing is that in terms of fighting a war abroad, like in a protracted conflict against effectively what is now a peer competitor, they're not doing well. When it comes to managing their own border, which is like one of the core things when, like, going back to like the Treaty of Westphalia here, one of the core things that defines sovereignty is the ability to control your own border, the ability to delimit territory that you assert belongs to you and are able to defend it from external invaders as well as internal disorder. If that starts coming into question, we then have to ask, what is the Russian state able to do in response? And if their big idea is effectively taking the failed lessons of the Ukraine war, which is indiscriminate shelling of basically a settlement until they basically level it, if they start to apply that to literally their own towns, as they've done in the past when it came to like Grozny during like, the first and second Chechen wars, but if they start doing that to basically their own Slavic Christian Russian settlements, then it indicates that there's relatively little there when it goes outside of like their core competencies of repressing citizens and engaging in large scale financial mismanagement and corruption.
Yeah, and the shelling there of their own towns. You mentioned the Chechen War. I I was a younger man then, and I sort of was not looking at it as closely as I sort of looked at recent world developments in the last 20 years or so. But I think it's fair to say that that also happened in the context where that's not the information saturated environment that we live in now. So I could only imagine that if if the Russia decides to start bombing Russia to fight back against the Russians, you're going to get a lot more sort of direct perspectives from that battlefield getting blasted out over, I would imagine, Telegram for starters, but also picked up by other individuals. And that I can only imagine that visual would have some blowback inside the Russian population, especially if you're living in a border town, right? That's one border town. Okay, what if these people cross somewhere else? Who's next, kind of thing. All right, but I do talking about the border and their ability or not to control it. I think kind of leads us into the next item of discussion here, which is the counteroffensive, which everybody, including us, has been sort of talking about for months, and sort of looking at every individual action. Like, is this it, right? Um, and I don't know if we're at the point of saying like, is this it yet? Although there seems to have been at least kind of an uptick in activities that maybe we're crossing from like long-term shaping to short-term shaping. But are so I guess do you think we're starting to see that time getting a little bit closer? One, but also the the inability to defend their own border next to a war zone. What implications does that potentially have for their ability to resist the counteroffensive, whenever it happens to come and wherever it happens to fall?
No, so certainly, like, again, something we've been talking about for months on end. But over the past couple of weeks, we saw basically, not just like the invasion of Russian territory by pro-Ukrainian Russian forces. We also saw that the Ukrainians attempted using naval drones, marine drones, to attack a intelligence vessel in the southwest Black Sea. That they attacked ships in port at Berdyansk, and as soon as again, Prigozhin and Wagner declared that they had completed the conquering of Bakhmut, and that they were going to hand over basically the town to the regular Russian military. That's essentially when Ukraine started attacking Bakhmut once more. Once the Russian military started to like relieve Wagner forces, the fighting capabilities declined immediately. So we can see that effective, in a certain sense, the shaping operations that you mentioned stretched Russian resources over an incredible distance. We're talking about, like, what, more than 1,000 kilometers all told, from both land and sea. The Russians, for their part, in recent weeks, as the Ukrainians started going on all these different, pressure points, started effectively, conducting airstrikes against Kyiv one more time, basically every single night for the past couple of weeks, in order to, one, obviously, destabilize the population, make them tired, make them irritable. Two, obviously, try to, if not be successful in terms of hitting their targets, at least force the Ukrainians to use up their air defense supplies, to which the United States has, given more munitions over the past week or so. But it seems that we are here where we are right now. That in terms of the Ukrainians putting out messages that they put out what looked to be like what was a recruiting video, but the main message was, we're going to take back what's ours. Zelensky going on television and saying, I've approved all plans. Everything at the political level has been decided. It's now purely military decision making from here on out. That this is, in essence, the counteroffensive that we're seeing is not just they're going to pick one place and attack it, but that they're, in a certain sense, saying the counteroffensive can come in many different places, and that we're going to try and go for lots of different things. We know that there's still a tremendous amount of Ukrainian military capability that has been training outside the country for the past 6 to 9 months, maybe 6 months
Yeah,
to a year or
long
so.
time.
That's the stuff that's been training for right now. We haven't yet seen it on the battlefield, but ostensibly all that stuff is coming. And that seems to be the counteroffensive, both in terms of what Ukraine is threatening, in terms of what they're doing, and in terms of what the Russians are trying to do in order to basically defend themselves and try to consolidate their gains and not lose as much territory as probably what they're afraid of, is what we're observing in real time over the past couple days.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that rundown. And I certainly the information, campaign does. I can understand like why you're both sort of saying it and not saying it, because that's sheer fact of uncertainty creates uncertainty in your adversary's mind, which is in itself a useful thing to have your adversary not be certain like where and when it's going to land. And maybe it's sort of a comparison, to another sort of historical event that, 79 years ago today, you had the D-Day landings right at Normandy, which was the kickoff for the counteroffensive of the Allies going to liberate France. But there's that sort of counteroffensive, that landing, that's a very meticulous, deliberate operation to conduct that over a large water crossing, the English Channel and stuff. That's something that requires sort of deliberate, methodical, and then when it happens, you can very much see it because it's got to go over certain deliberate channels. Whereas this is a major land war, and it could be like it's not going to be just one deliberate thrust in one direction, but it could be multiple thrusts in multiple directions, and we may not really know sort of where the main effort is until it's well underway. And the information campaign of uncertainty is in support of that. But yeah, the message does seem to be at least that the day is coming. It is coming closer. And I guess with that kind of leads us into our third major item today, which is I think probably like, yeah, I think you messaged me last night, but I woke up this morning to the news that a significant dam across the Dnipro River had failed and was flooding all the way downriver into the Kherson region, both in Ukrainian territory and Russian occupied territory. And the dam is, you can correct me if I pronounce this wrong, but the Nova Kakhovka dam, which has been, reading through it, it crosses the Dnipro. The dam itself is sort of a no man's land because Ukraine controls one side of the river, Russia controls the other side of the river, and there's been fighting in its vicinity for months. And
Right.
although, as I understand it, the control buildings and like the things that operate the dam's functions, as well as the emergency relief functions of the dam, are on the Russian side. But with all that, the point is, this morning, the dam had clearly failed, massive hole in it, and water was gushing downriver, causing serious flooding wherever it's going. And I guess to take it from there, Yuval, what are some of the short term impacts of this? What does it potentially do to any attempt for a Ukrainian counteroffensive in that area specifically? But then what are the longer term impacts of this potentially for that, for both for the war and for that region?
Right. There's a lot to unpack here, and we should note that for whenever people listen or watch this, it's June 6th, 12:43 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. As yet, we're just speculating on stuff that is basically 12 to 16 hours old in terms of information. We don't know. So it's not that we're trying to be vague or wishy-washy. We just sort of want to lay out everything that we know because we want to try and distinguish between intent. Until we have evidence of who did it, we don't know. What's basically the operational impact? Again, speculation writ large. And then what are the strategic repercussions? Again, speculation writ large. So in a certain sense, when before this, the dam experienced, effectively catastrophic failure or was destroyed from the inside, by whatever means, the Russian sort of information space between people on TV and the military bloggers on Telegram were in a state of complete and unrepentant anger at obviously like Ukraine and the West, but there was a clear sense of how are we not able to withstand all of this? If we don't do something dramatic, if we don't do something big, the Ukrainians are going to win. And obviously, they don't say it directly like that, but they say that our victory will be further into the future. It'll be more difficult to achieve victory in a special military operation, which is a euphemism for we're going to lose. So that's basically one part of it. Now, as we've been, trying to figure out, reading different sorts of sources, different sort of commentators, there is, let's say, in terms of the intent piece, there's the blame the Ukrainians story and blame the Russian story. For the benefit, if you blame Ukraine for doing this, that basically the Ukrainians were the ones who destroyed the dam in order to basically flood their region. What do we know for sure, like in terms of what has happened already in reality, in order to sort of situate the blame Ukraine story? There is flooding, and there are at this point at minimum not just like probably in the low 10, 20, 30 settlements that are basically going to disappear from the map. Around, so the figures that I've seen is somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people need to be evacuated immediately, like Ukrainian citizens who are no longer going to live where they have lived for however many generations. So there's that. If you blame Ukraine, your story is this is flooding. So when people talk about left bank, right bank, it's thinking the water's flowing towards the Black Sea. So the left bank is the one that is controlled by Russia. The right bank is controlled by Ukraine. Many months ago, the Russians controlled not just the left bank, but the right bank as well. They held the city of Kherson, and in the last counteroffensive, one of the sort of major victories of the Ukrainians was getting the Russians to actually abandon Kherson city. 2 days later, some might recall, Zelensky went there, and in full shelling distance of the Russians, he went and he met the people of Kherson. This was actually, in a certain sense, a demonstration that the Russians were able to do something as complicated as a river crossing. So, and as you put it, the Ukrainians are on one side, the Russians on the other. The blame Ukraine story is that the Ukrainians basically destroyed the dam to flood the area in order to wash away all the defensive fortifications, all the soldiers on the basically the Russian side, so that even though they may have wanted to like do a river crossing over the Dnipro at that area, by at least washing away what's there, they're going to be able to do a much easier crossing later on. That's part one. And part two is obviously because this is the water that provides for the drinking water of Crimea, by basically starving Crimea of this very critical resource, which had been part of the reason that Russia started this war in the first place, that they're going to be creating pandemonium within Crimea, so that they create basically this more difficult situation for Russian authorities there, and basically people fleeing from that. That's basically the blame Ukraine story. The blame Russia story is, in terms of the short term, if the Ukrainians had been working really hard to lengthen the line that Russia had to defend, they now get to shorten the line. Because in the short term, even if it's easier for Ukraine to invade or to basically do river crossings in this area in the future, that's not going to happen for weeks at best, and will allow Russia to basically move the resources that were in basically the far south of Ukraine, basically further north and further east, in order to provide greater defensive depth. That's basically the blame Russia story. What we know for sure is that this is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe now for basically all the people in the region. What we also know is that in terms of the agriculture, these are all agricultural areas. The issues that we've talked about over the past year in terms of ensuring that Russia and Ukraine are able to jointly move grain out of this area so that the global south does not starve, that's going to be an issue over the course of this year. Russia had a very good crop this year. Who knows how much of that they're going to be willing to sell, just in general, and certainly sell at prices the global south can afford. So we as yet don't know, but we know this is bad for the people living there. We know this is bad for agriculture and therefore the global south. We do know that in the short term, this is a benefit to the Russian military. In the long term, this is going to be a benefit to the Ukrainian military. We don't know if anyone bombed it. We don't know if basically, there were already explosives inside the dam. It failed due to mismanagement and incompetence. And, in effect, the explosions were some sort of secondary impact. That's basically where we are with the collapse of the Nova Kakhovka dam.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you call it like a 2.5 or what have you, but that final point there you mentioned, it was something you'd shared I think it was I don't know if it was an engineer or a specialist on social media, but indicating that it may have failed simply because it was not maintained, and like I said, essentially a no man's land where neither side could conduct the proper preventative maintenance or reactive maintenance. And I think there was some information about how there had been very high water levels earlier on in the year, which potentially put some stress on it. And then all the fighting in the region, certainly doesn't help in the integrity of a complex piece of infrastructure that needs to be watched very closely. Although at the end of the day, if Russia hadn't invaded, it wouldn't be a problem with the dam. So there's that.
So we also do know that there are also like other things. The other thing to mention is that this is the water, basically, that both the electricity and the water that this dam provided is critical for the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. This is the water that helps cool those nuclear reactors. Now, those nuclear reactors have not been working for quite a while, so they are cool in the general sense. But nevertheless, that power plant requires this water just to maintain operations, even in its current dormant state. So that's something to just sort of keep in mind, because the Ukrainians have said that the Russians are going to simulate a a disaster, a meltdown at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant for at least the past 2 weeks. We can also note that in terms of Russian media, like the state media, um, they as of yet don't yet know how to cover this beyond for blaming Ukraine. At minimum, it seems that this was a surprise to a great number of people, but this is a surprise that could be devastating in its consequences.
Yeah, and I think that was something that was definitely the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was like, on the top list of concerns that were getting discussed. And I think that um, at least at the moment, the Ukrainian government has said that there's no immediate risk to loss of the cooling ability from this flood. But I mean, like you said, this is 12 hours later. The longer term impacts of this uh, are just going to have to be observed as they unfold. And it just, I've been in watching the nuclear power plant. It's been an item of discussion almost since the very beginning. Because I think we all remember there was some pretty just unreal footage, security camera footage of Russian forces rolling into the plant, shooting, kind of willy nilly, or like, you know, do they know where they are, kind of thing, you know. Not, and they may not have known where they are because they blew into the Chernobyl, zone, and were digging foxholes in there because nobody had told them that they were in the Chernobyl zone and maybe they shouldn't dig into the dirt. So, the level of awareness of the average Russian soldier, who knows? Um, but even and it's cooled down, sort of, low operating tempo, like it's a freaking nuclear power plant. You know, you just don't want to mess with that. And that thing has had I think it's had its backup power supply interrupted previously. It's been fought over. Um, the engineers, as I understand it, have basically sort of been hostages there since the plant was taken over. And who knows? Again, kind of, it's a large, complex piece of infrastructure. Who knows if they've been able to maintain it even close to the minimum safe standards required? Uh, and now this, right? Like how many more balls can the nuclear power plant juggle before something bad happens?
It's absolutely unreal. Whatever's the If there's a word that sort of combines like heartbreaking and wacky, like that's basically every single day so far.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that this will not be the last likely unreal and wacky thing um, that we see. It's just the latest. Okay. Do any other things you want to cover, or anything we're sort of, you think the audience should be watching here in the next week or so?
Yeah, so I mean, so besides for managing, this is the latest shiny thing. Last week's shiny thing was the basically invasion of Russia. This will be basically managing the fallout from this will occupy, I think, the world's attention for the next couple of days. But the Ukrainians, by all appearances, are continuing on in their counteroffensive in other places. Now, it's quite possible that they anticipated this. There's a contingency plan. I obviously neither you nor I know what like the plans are, but it couldn't have been outside the realm of possibility if the Ukrainians have been talking about this for the last several weeks that they hadn't anticipated that this might happen. So we still have not seen the application of mass forces elsewhere in Ukraine. So again, between Belgorod and let's say Odessa, sort of towards the south of the country, it's nearly 1,000 kilometers. Um, so the Ukrainians could be attacking anywhere along those areas, whether they basically, you know, go for the middle like Mariupol, Melitopol, whether they go directly at Donetsk, whether they want to retake Bakhmut. Like, just because this is the thing of today doesn't mean that the counteroffensive is paused altogether.
Oh, although I would imagine at an absolute minimum, this is going to divert some energy and resources to humanitarian relief and disaster management in a way that was not necessarily expected. Although again, I don't know, maybe they have a break glass in case of emergency, worst case plan where Russia blows a dam or two and they have some sort of response plan ready to go.
Again, over the in our next episode, hopefully, in a couple of days, we'll sort of figure out like, we'll have better understanding. How much equipment did the Russians lose, or did they remove troops from this area, which indicates, pieces of indirect evidence that they're behind it, or did they basically lose people and equipment? It could also be that, the Russian military leadership was willing to just sacrifice those people because they haven't been interested in the preservation of human life so far. But we'll just try to figure out over the next couple of days who did this, and what are the implications, both short term and long term. Certainly, in terms of the long term, fresh water for the region and Crimea is going to be critical, because even though Crimea is about 60 odd miles away, this is the water that basically kept that place hydrated. And if they don't get it, what does that say about the Crimea or the south of, the currently occupied territory that Ukraine is either going to retake and have to rebuild at tremendous cost, or whether the Russians are willing to just let this area be depopulated?
Another thing to watch, and yeah, as you said, one of the impact on Crimea was one of the on that list of near-term impacts, and I think initial from the Russian side comments were that whatever the reservoirs are in Crimea, they're topped up sufficiently that this is not going to be an impact there. But who knows? They could be telling the truth, or they could not be telling the truth, and they just want to say something positive because there's nothing positive that's actually going to come out of this. But yeah, that will be something to watch again, whether or not there's sufficient drinking water left down there and what that does to the population. And we were last thing I'll throw out there, and I guess maybe we can wrap up, is another thing that was noted on social media today was, in days in history, not today, but this is not the first time that Russians have blown up dams on the river, as well as not caring about what happens. There was the Dnipro Dam, which is not located on the same place of the river, but as part of Soviet withdrawal from Ukraine against the Nazis in World War II, they blew that dam to halt, slow the Nazis down at least. But they blew it completely, without regard to the civilians or their own troops who were downstream. So, the Russian tradition of I don't care who dies kind of thing, still alive and well.
Sort of at best is, in the Russians, at least according to the official line, still consider this area to be Russia.
Well, this is
But
part of the annexed provinces, right? Like
this is part of the next
that
province.
Putin is going to, defend the same way he would defend all Russian territory, right?
So at best, so at worst, they basically exploded their own dam, so to speak, and at worst, they permitted, a catastrophic failure through mismanagement, or failed to defend it from, enemy forces, as it were. But there's just the future for Russia is not bright in this region.
No, I mean, and it's probably in the near term for sure. It's not bright for anyone who's downstream there. It's whether intentional or just complete negligence of it. It's very tragic to watch. But again, unfortunately, this is not going to be the last surreal and just things previously sort of unimaginable on a modern battlefield, or now we're watching it there, and there will probably be more, unfortunately. Okay, so I think we've hit everything we wanted to discuss there, and since we kind of went extra long on the last episode, don't feel bad about not going long for the sake of going long on this one. So I think good place to stop. And again, between this and whatever sort of trajectory the Ukrainian counteroffensive ultimately does take, are going to be two big things that we're going to be watching here in the next few days or a week or so. But Yuval, as always, great to talk with you. Thank you for kind of put this one together pretty quickly based on unfolding events. But we'll do it as we have to. But until then, we'll keep watching. And to our audience, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all on the next one. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.